Welcome back from break. Like I said, I've got a short presentation talking about the National Historic Landmark designation, and then Mike McComb will be talking about aviation archaeology to wrap up the night. And I think we'll still have a little bit of time to do a question and answer session, but I'll turn that back over to Barbara and Mike for that. Welcome everybody, especially friends and family of passengers on the two flights that we've heard about today. This day has been for you. I'll be talking about the process that the park went through to designate the sites as a National Historic Landmark, and that in and of itself sounds pretty benign, but there was a lot there that had to happen to make that happen, and it's now part of parks history as well as the public history. So it really is the intersection of many, many things and many, many years of effort. So I will go through that. The designation itself of the crash sites really started and starts with our institutional memory, and that is the institution of the National Park Service, but also the institution of family and friends and partners of the National Park Service, whose memory of the crash and its after effects helped shape the Park Service's view of what to do with the crash sites over time. And that view really, really has changed. I'm going to go back to the day of and shortly before the accident to kind of set a context and to help us understand what the National Park Service staff and personnel were doing at the time and what their response was and how that fed into the bigger response of the accident itself. There were a record number of visitors in June of 1956. And in fact, the superintendent at the time predicted that year would be the first year that the park would receive 1 million visitors. And sure enough, his prediction came true in November of that year. And the picture on the right there is the 1 millionth visitor, a 4-year-old with her family visiting the South Rim. How's that? So there's the 1 millionth visitor. You can imagine the effects of the chaos that the rescue and recovery operation brought to the national parks. And Park Service management, of course, at the time was having to manage its visitors at peak season as well as a major national incident. And so, that was chaotic and traumatic for park staff in and of itself. The Park Service and the superintendent and the chief rangers and their staff played a minor role in terms of the total number of people involved in the rescue and recovery operation, but they were there at the very beginning and they made some very critical decisions, and I'll just mention a couple. One was that they made the suggestion to the Air Force and the U.S. Army to try to use helicopters rather than trying to land fixed-wing aircraft in the canyon, which had been done before, prior to 1956, and it was on the minds of the U.S. military to try to do that. They weren't as familiar with the terrain and the flying conditions as the National Park Service was. And so they relied on that intelligence from the National Park Service to make that decision. They also, the Park Service supported efforts to try to access United by climbing, by pedestrian access. And that helped the airlines decide to bring in the Colorado Mountain Club and the Swiss rescue crew to try to get to United the way they did. Another thing was to move the operation of rescue and recovery from Winslow, Arizona up to the Red Butte Airport, which was much closer, and it was not as developed, but it was certainly adequate enough to support the rescue and recovery operation. Of course, it made national headlines as we've heard today, and as some of you may remember, it made headlines, and it was a national story, and that had an effect on everybody in the country, and especially family and friends of passengers on those two planes. I don't have a personal connection to anybody on either of the flights, but my dad developed a fear of flying because of this. He was a 19-year-old young college student in Chicago, And he had flown prior to this with his family to California and back several times. But after this accident, he never flew again, except, under, 2 occasions when he was forced to. And so he was one of the members of the public who said, this is an impossible accident. How could this happen? This shouldn't have happened, and it could happen again, so I'm not going to fly again. And of course, a lot of people, I think, had that same reaction. So with that, the involvement of the National Park Service and the Grand Canyon National Park staff, in those early days of the rescue and recovery operation, and then the weeks that followed after the burials at the 2 grave sites. The superintendent reflected on that in his monthly report, and I'll read from that. It's on the screen as well. A pall of concern and sadness settled over the general area, which will remain for a long time. July 1956 will be long discussed and never forgotten. And I'm so thankful that he took the time to reflect on that and report it in his monthly report, because here we are today remembering it and not forgetting. Like I said, those sentiments from the National Park Service at the time, is the origin of our institutional memory of the accident and how the thinking of the park and park management evolved from that point forward until we were able to begin the process for a National Historic Landmark designation. Our memory was refreshed in 1976 when the park contracted with the airlines to remove more wreckage from the sites. It had been 20 years since the accident. There was pressure on the leadership of the park to do something about those crash sites. At the time, the thinking, of course, was not toward historical preservation or memorialization. It was more in line with the environmental ethic of the time to clean up litter and to provide access to visitors. And so for those 2 reasons and a few others, the park said, we can do these things, but we need to clean up those sites further. And so the park contracted with a company to go in with helicopters and fly out a lot of the wreckage that still remained at the time. And what that looked like at the time in the summer and fall of 1976 was this. They had Jet Ranger helicopters with sling loads below them, and they had a ground crew that would assemble the big wreck pieces into those nets, those cargo nets, and they would fly those out from the inner canyon, and they staged them up on the rim where they were transported then to recycling centers, basically, where they were after the aluminum and other metals in the aircraft that at the time had some value. A couple of other images of those helicopters lifting wreckage from the site. And that's a photograph of where they staged that material from the helicopters so the trucks could haul that to the recycling centers. "30 more years go by, and we're at 2006 now, and it's the 50th anniversary. And that's a pretty significant pivoting point for everybody. It's been 30 years since the wreck sites, number one, had been cleaned up for the prior time. And at that point in 1976, the park made the decision to lift the closure around the 2 crash sites and open that up to the public. And in that intervening time between 1976 and 2006, there were lots of reports and lots of cases of people going to those sites and collecting things from them and taking them. And the park's thinking, had evolved in those 30 years more toward historic preservation. Now that the sites had been cleaned up, and now that that history had evolved and we could reflect on it over a 50-year period, the thinking started to change about what can we do to those sites in line with historic preservation and memorialization. And there were many, many people, at that time in 2006 who wanted to do something in this sentiment. And a lot of that came from the river community, where, if you're on I think it's been mentioned a couple of times, where people on whitewater rafting trips through the Grand Canyon have the closest proximity and sometimes the closest access to the crash sites. And so it was part of Colorado River lore to talk about the crash sites and what that meant and where they were located. And so the river community, I think, was quite interested in doing something, that the park should do something at that time to memorialize the sites. And so a lecture series was sponsored by the Grand Canyon Conservancy, then the Grand Canyon Association, as well as the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And they did this lecture series, kind of like what we're doing this afternoon, and brought in historians and lecturers and aviation experts to bring to the public's attention what happened and the possibilities of how it could be managed in the future. And so we have those folks to thank in 2006, the people who organized and advocated for some kind of memorialization for the origins for an effort for National Historic Landmark designation. Similar to today, the mass grave sites serve as a very nice location to host family and friends and park employees in some kind of effort at that remembrance. And in 2006, we had wreaths, we had speakers at the grave sites, and it was on a much smaller scale than we've had in the subsequent years, but it was really the start of that effort. The park itself was able to publicly recognize the importance and significance of the accident. And this is a headline from an all-employee newsletter called Inside NPS, and the aviation manager at the time wrote it because for almost 30 years he had seen park leadership have interest in the crash sites, but not enough to do anything to be able to recognize those in a meaningful way. So he was very interested and involved in bringing to the public's attention and bringing to the Park Service's attention about the significance of this site. So 50 years is a milestone, right? I mean, that's a big year for whether you're celebrating an anniversary or a wedding anniversary or something like this. And so that was really a nice pivoting point for us to start thinking about what we could do as park management to both preserve and protect the sites, as well as bringing some kind of recognition to the significance of the sites themselves. So here I'm going to talk about archaeology and using archaeological method to start that process. And for many reasons, 50 years is kind of a milestone in the historic preservation world. And for anybody who works in historic preservation, whether you're an archaeologist or an architect or something in between, the National Historic Preservation Act doesn't require, but suggests that properties that are 50 years old and older can be considered for eligibility to the National Register of Historic Places, which is the registry where you recognize the importance of some piece of history, whether that's archaeological or a piece of architecture or the site of an important event. And so we hit that 50-year mark in 2006, and we began to start thinking about what we could do both to commemorate but also on the preservation and protection side of things. And for many decades, like I mentioned, the park had many cases and incidents of people going to the sites and taking wreckage and personal items. And the park did not like that and thought that it was time to do something to cement the legal responsibility of the Park Service to protecting those sites. So we hit the 50-year mark, and we had to develop some method for registering the sites as official places of history. And where you start with that is doing an archaeological survey and inventory and recording the sites as archaeological sites. Now, in the National Park Service, that method includes things such as, making maps with GPS units, taking an inventory of the items that remain on the ground, and it's evaluating the site for what remains on the ground. In other words, you're doing a condition of the ground surface and everything on it to get an understanding, the basic question being, can you still recognize this as an aviation accident site? If anybody walked across it, could you recognize this as the impact sites for the TWA and the United Flight? The answer is overwhelmingly yes, even after 3 episodes of major cleanups, including 1976. There's no doubt in anybody's mind when you walk across those sites that you will recognize that as a scene of a horrific accident. And so we used archaeological methods, but I want to pause there and explain that in the National Park Service, and especially in a national park, archaeology does not include excavation. It does not include collection of artifacts, and it does not include any other disturbance to help document that. So, it's very light on the land, in other words. And so we used archaeological methods basically to document what was there, and that's kind of a baseline for how we develop our language and our writing about the importance of the site for National Historic Landmark designation. So I just want to be clear, these pictures show us doing archaeology, but what we're doing is getting up close and personal to the main wreckage area, using pin flags to identify the location of those important items that anybody would recognize as either pieces of aircraft or wreckage. And that was it. We leave the items in place, we pull the flags, we've got a map of it. We can create a distribution of all of those flags together and show where the main concentrations of wreckage is, where things are scattered, where on the slopes they're a little bit more vulnerable to erosion from the natural slope and that kind of stuff. And so that's what we did. We cataloged the items, we made good detailed maps, we took photographs, and then we left everything in place where it was. With that information, we were able to argue that the site was eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. It met all of the eligibility requirements and allowed us to make a permanent record in the state of Arizona and in the National Park Service through 2 different databases. So at that point, it became an official place of important and significant history. It had a documented history itself, but also a documented, catalog of items, a map to show the limits of that, and we were on pretty solid ground for the basis for preservation and protection mission. If anybody's wondering, how we did this at the United site, we did it very carefully. It's very, very strenuous work. It's very difficult, and we had a team, a very small team of 5 of us, who, a couple people, their expertise or their skill was technical rigging. So we were all in harnesses and climbing gear, basically, to go down for very short periods of time onto the slope and try to get a better sense of what still remains there. And so that's what we did. On this one, it was a 4-day trip. And I can say, in my career, at this point I had been doing archaeology, anything like this, but I had been doing this kind of field work and thought I was fairly skilled and in pretty good shape to do it, but it was extremely draining to be there. And I realized only later, reflecting back on it, that I was super prepared to go and do this work. We had been planning it for 3 years, and it was meticulous planning, and it was a matter of teamwork, and we brought management together with the field team, and we had a very solid plan. and we had lists and equipment and all this, but I can tell you what it did not prepare us for is the emotional and spiritual impact that that has on somebody, you know, doing this kind of work and walking around. And I mean, you can see it's literally in our face, and it was difficult for that reason as well, and very, very draining. It was very tiring work. Okay, so we're leading up to National Historic Landmark designation, and just to remind you of what National Historic Landmarks are, Brian touched on that a little bit this morning. A National Historic Landmark is the exceptional locations of significant U.S. history. And I mentioned that we had recorded the sites as archaeological sites, but, you know, and that's just the baseline, but it's a whole lot more than that. It's not just archaeological, as we know, and how this the last 20 years, it's so much more than that. But that does serve as the basis for the documentation, at least. You know, the landmarks in the United States, there are only 2,600 of them, compared to over 90,000 properties on the National Register of Historic Places. So to get it to that National Historic Landmark designation really requires some pretty vigorous articulation of the significance of that history, a lot of good writing and research. And we partnered with several people to help us write that document where we were asking for National Historic Landmark status. So, you know, properties on the National Register are known to cities and states. National Historic Landmarks are known across the country. And the examples here, you know, the Statue of Liberty and Independence Hall, those are examples of National Historic Landmarks known across the country. Their architecture is very recognizable. In an aviation history, the Wright brothers and the Dayton Aviation Historic Site are examples of National Historic Landmarks in the aviation world. So that was a little about what the NHL program is. We were very fortunate in the late 2000s and early 2010s that the National Historic Landmark program was writing a theme study called American Aviation Heritage. And they caught wind of our work here and recognized that it could fit very well in their overall history of the aviation in the United States. And where it fit was very unique in terms of, you know, most aviation history celebrates, you know, either aircraft technology or the site, like the Wright brothers, you know, the location of their first flight and that kind of thing. And we had an aviation accident site, a crash site. So where does that fit into the bigger picture of aviation history? Well, it has to do with airways modernization, and we've heard that several times today, that this accident didn't create the FAA, but it certainly was a watershed moment that really turned the politics in this country toward the resources needed for new aviation safety technology. And in the theme study, you know, they state the 1956 aviation crash in the Grand Canyon prompted political events that modernized air traffic control systems and aviation safety regulations. No single event in American history has contributed more to the current system of air safety than the Grand Canyon disaster. In response to the crash, Congress passed the Airways Modernization Act of 1957 and the Federal Aviation Act of 1958 that established a board responsible for the development and modernization of the national system of air traffic control facilities. Those are their words. Those weren't our words, you know, in our nomination. Those were identified in the theme study. And so we had a very nice pairing for how to move forward with the nomination for the sites. And to our surprise, you know, crash sites are significant enough that they were included in the bigger theme of American aviation. So a little bit about the timeline. You know, we started in 2006, continued through 2008, submitted our documents in 2011. And, as you can guess, lots of review and approval, and, when you're asking the Department of Interior for that stamp of designation, there's a lot that you have to do, both internally as well as, advertising to the public about the intent of this. And so part of that is the Federal Register, where you're putting out for public comment what the intent is and what the effect of the nomination might be. And we accomplished that in 2011. And then lots and lots of boards and reviews and committees, as you can imagine, goes back and forth, and this went on for, close to 8 years. And, this is the main point here, is that the Landmarks Committee made this recommendation, and I think this was the most important part of our nomination process, and the part that we did not think enough about early in the process. What they recommended was that we pause the nomination and make an effort to notify family of passengers on those planes as part of an outreach, as part of the effort to articulate the significance of it. Why are these sites important? Well, why don't you ask the family who was affected? And it put a big pause on it, and it took us almost 2 years to do it. But I think this was the single most important thing that happened in that whole 8-year process, is doing the work to try to notify and invite family members to come forward and review what we were trying to do. That was a huge effort, and it was a small number that we started with, but so many people, some of whom are on this slide, made that effort in the 2-year period that it took us. And these are people in the Park Service as well as people in our partner organizations like the Grand Canyon Historical Society and Grand Canyon Association. So we owe a lot to that effort in 2010 and 2012. The result of that was a report that Jan Balsam and I put together about our efforts and the notifications that we sent out and some of the responses we got back from the family members. And overwhelmingly, the response we got, and not 100%, just the majority of the responses were very positive about trying to bring this history forward and trying to bring this history into the public realm. And these are from family members who thought it was important to never forget and to somehow commemorate that history. And with that, in April of 2014, we got word that the Secretary of Interior had signed off on our National Historic Landmark designation. And we were very excited and very scared at the same time. It's a huge responsibility to manage a National Historic Landmark in your park. And thanks to Jan and park management, they were behind it and they supported it. And I think we did it pretty well. And that's part of all of our legacy now, is trying to manage this in the future and going forward. What does that mean to family and friends? What does that mean to our visitors? We heard a little bit about that from Brian this morning. We hear about that from you all here. What does that mean for the Park Service? We take that responsibility very seriously. Quickly following after April 2014, we were able to do a commemoration event where the National Historic Landmark plaque was unveiled. Family members were there, and it was a wonderful, bringing together of a lot of effort and a lot of families. And we heard more than once that, and we continue to hear that the daughters and sons of people that were on that plane were meeting for the first time. They knew they were on, their fathers and aunts and uncles were on that plane with their co-workers or with their other family members, and they were meeting for the first time, and that's golden. I mean, that is precisely what the National Park Service would hope to, come from that effort. And just a few images of that celebration in 2014. And, at the time when we were writing this, it was very textbook. It was very, cut and dry. It was very procedural. But after the recommendation to do this outreach to family, it became, it took on a life of its own, and it became so much richer and so much deeper for all of us, and the meaning of it became so much more apparent than what the original effort had envisioned. And I can tell you, I think Barbara mentioned it this morning, that at that moment in 2014, we were looking behind us at the history, we were looking at the current situation. We were also looking forward to what this means in the next 20 years, 50 years. And the suggestion for a patrons group, the idea that came together organically in that gathering of people. And I can tell you, I can't be happier to see how that has evolved in the last 12 years. This patrons group is just phenomenal. And what they've been able to do, I mean, that is exactly what we envisioned back in that time, and how that's evolved. And I can't thank you enough for that work and what you've done for you all, but also for the National Park Service. And moving forward, I'll close just by saying, another note on the responsibility of the National Park Service. When everybody else goes away, we still have to manage the site. We still have to look at it every day. The people in uniform that you see here, they're the ones who, this is in their minds daily. And imagine the responsibility that they feel to all of their constituents to try to preserve and protect and commemorate this site. Both of those accident sites are on National Park Service land, and forever, as long as there's a National Park Service, it's going to be our responsibility. We can't do that alone, and I'm so happy we have partners, we have patrons groups, we have associations to help us do that. And I hope if the trajectory holds true, then we're on a very nice golden path to continue these anniversary events and commemorations. So with that, thank you very much. I hope you learned a little bit about the National Historic Landmark effort and what we did. If you have any questions, I think there will be time for questions and answers. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it. So turn it back over to you guys.